The ladder groaned under Takuma's weight as he descended, each step echoing against the rough stone walls. His flashlight carved thin slices of light through the suffocating darkness. The cellar was colder than the house above, damp with the smell of wet earth and old rot. He touched down on the hard-packed ground, his shoes crunching over gravel and dust. For a long moment, he simply stood there, straining to hear anything beyond the sound of his own heartbeat. The beam swept across the room, revealing nothing but the crude masonry of the foundation, piles of cobwebs, and a stack of old blankets in the far corner. He edged closer, the silence pressing against his ears. Then, without warning, the mound of blankets shifted. His throat closed. The light caught a frail hand pushing through the folds. "Mommy?" a voice whispered. Thin, trembling, childlike. Takuma stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. From beneath the blankets, a boy's face appeared. Pale, almost translucent, with dark circles under his eyes. His lips quivered as he asked, "Who are you?" "Have you seen my friend Kaoru? Mommy says he plays with me." The word struck Takuma with the force of a blow. Kaoru. That was the name scrawled in the sketchbook upstairs. His mind raced. Was this a child who had somehow been left here? But how could that be? The records, the drawings, the dust. It all suggested decades had passed. This boy looked no older than 7 or 8. I don't know," Takuma stammered, forcing air into his lungs. "Why are you here?" The boy blinked slowly, his voice steady but distant. "This is my place. This is where I wait. Kaoru plays with me." Every instinct screamed at Takuma to run, but he managed to nod instead. "I'll get help," he said, his voice barely audible. He turned and scrambled back up the ladder, slamming the hatch shut behind him as if to trap something inside. His legs shook as he fumbled with his phone, dialing the police. Minutes later, flashing lights filled the small road outside. Officers hurried in, their radios crackling. Takuma led them to the hatch, his words tumbling over one another. He watched as 2 officers descended, flashlights bobbing in the darkness. Then came the silence, followed by the sound of boots clattering as they rushed back up, their faces drained of color. "There's no living child down there," one officer told him, his voice flat. "But we found remains, 2 of them." The words hollowed out the air around Takuma. The officers returned with evidence bags and grim faces. They explained what they had found, the skeletal remains of a small boy and a woman, lying side by side on the cellar floor. From their condition, they had been dead for many years. The boy had succumbed to complications from his illness. The woman, his mother, had overdosed on sleeping pills, her body still curled protectively near her child. But that wasn't all. Among the remains was a folded letter, ink faded, but still legible. In it, the mother confessed to something darker. She wrote that after her son Riku died, she could not let him go. Her grief consumed her. Desperate, she began abducting local boys around the same age, caring for them in the boarded-up room, feeding them, telling them stories, all while insisting they were her Riku. She admitted she knew they were not her son, but for a few stolen days, she could pretend. In every smile she saw, she imagined what her child might have been like had he lived. When the illusion broke, she returned the boys to their families. The letter ended in despair. "I cannot go on. He has left me, but I cannot live without him. I must follow him now." Takuma felt the room tilt around him. His mind returned to the pale boy in the cellar, whispering about Kaoru. He had spoken with him, heard his voice, seen his eyes. Yet according to the police, that boy had died years before. Even after the officers sealed off the property, even after the coroner's van took the remains away, Takuma could not shake the sound of that fragile voice. It wasn't only the house that held the past. It was something stronger, something that refused to move on. And as he stepped outside into the dimming light, he realized the tragedy was not just in what had happened, but in how fiercely love can twist when it refuses to let go. For days after the police investigation, Takuma could not sleep without seeing that cellar again. Each time he closed his eyes, he imagined the pale face of the boy emerging from the blankets, his whisper drifting through the silence. "Have you seen Kaoru?" It was not simply fear that unsettled him, but the weight of sadness behind those words. He had encountered something that defied explanation, something caught between memory and reality. When the case reached the newspapers, more details emerged. Several families from nearby towns came forward, each with sons who had gone missing briefly years before. Astonishingly, all the boys had been returned unharmed after a few days, yet their stories matched. They spoke of being kept in a windowless room by a woman they called Auntie. She had fed them, told them stories, even played games with them, but she always insisted they were Riku. The children described her as gentle and kind, though sorrow clung to her words like a shadow. None of them had understood at the time, and their parents had dismissed the tales as childhood confusion, grateful only that their sons were home. Now, the truth unraveled in a way that chilled everyone who heard it. The woman's grief had led her to borrow other people's children, not to harm them, but to momentarily ease her own agony. In those fleeting moments, she could pretend her sick child had never left her. But in doing so, she bound herself to a lie so consuming that it poisoned both her life and her afterlife. Takuma returned to the property once, weeks later, under the supervision of the owner who had inherited the land. The owner, ashamed and shaken, told him the woman was his aunt. She had vanished decades ago, and only now did he learn the full truth. He intended to demolish the house entirely, to erase the scars it carried. But as Takuma stood in that hallway again, his eyes drawn to the sticker on the sliding door, he felt a presence as real as the wooden floor beneath him. Some things, he thought, cannot be torn down with lumber and nails. The sketchbook still haunted him most. The image of two boys, Riku and Kaoru, seemed to speak of a friendship that may never have existed outside the child's imagination. Perhaps Kaoru was an invention, a way for Riku to dream of companionship in his sealed-off world. Or perhaps Kaoru was something else, a visitor only he could see. The unanswered questions gnawed at Takuma. Was the boy he met in the cellar truly Riku's spirit, still waiting for his imaginary friend? Or was it a vision shaped by the grief his mother left behind? What made the story more unbearable was the tenderness in the abductions. Those boys had remembered her not as a monster, but as a caretaker. It was the contradiction that struck hardest, an act both cruel and kind, both terrifying and heartbreakingly human. Her obsession twisted love into captivity, but her heart had never been driven by malice. Instead, it had been strangled by loss. Neighbors whispered that even after the house was sealed, the fields around it felt different. Children playing nearby claimed they heard knocking sounds coming from beneath the earth. Some said they saw a boy's silhouette standing in the upstairs window, even though the plank still covered the glass. Each story added another layer to the tragedy, ensuring the tale would never fade completely. Takuma, now older, would later admit that the encounter changed how he saw his own work. Architecture, he realized, was not only about walls and roofs. Houses were vessels of memory, places that absorbed joy and despair alike. This house had carried grief so heavy that it seemed to bleed through the walls, binding a mother and son in a prison neither could escape. And so, the image lingered, a child's voice echoing in darkness, a desperate mother's love stretching far beyond life, and a young man forever haunted by what he saw when he opened that hatch. Not long after the Japanese case reached its grim conclusion, another story emerged from a very different corner of Asia, one that carried its own weight of sorrow. This time it was in Thailand, and though the setting was far removed from the countryside house in Saitama, the themes of desperation, loss, and restless spirits wove themselves into something equally chilling. Somchai was a man in his early 40s who had spent most of his life working in factories. He had never earned much, but he had always managed to scrape by. Then one spring, the factory where he labored shut its doors without warning. Overnight, his paycheck vanished. With rent overdue and little savings, Somchai felt the ground slipping out from under him. His dreams of providing a better life for his family had been replaced by fear of losing even the tiny apartment he called home. When a former co-worker called and told him about a possible job, Somchai barely let the man finish before agreeing to meet. The offer sounded like salvation, a caretaker position at a large house in the city. The duties were light: watering the garden, collecting the mail, keeping watch over the property when the owner was away. Meals would be provided, and best of all, a room on the property would be his. For a man on the edge of homelessness, it felt like a miracle. The next morning, Somchai took a crowded bus across town. He stepped off into a neighborhood unlike any he had ever lived in before. Mansions lined the streets, each hidden behind tall gates and manicured gardens. When he reached the address, his mouth went dry. The house stretched wide and elegant, its walls gleaming, its grounds meticulously landscaped. Somchai had only seen places like this in movies. Now he was about to live in one. A maid ushered him through the gate, and soon he was sitting across from the owner, a businessman around his own age. The contrast between them stung. While Somchai had aged under the strain of factory work, the owner looked polished, his success reflected in every polished tile and shining surface around them. Yet he spoke kindly and offered the job on the spot. The owner gave him a quick tour. The garage alone stunned Somchai. Inside were 2 cars worth more than he could earn in a lifetime. Then he was shown the small caretaker's room at the back of the property. It was simple: a bed, a wardrobe, a dressing table, and a small bathroom with a working air conditioner. But to Somchai it felt like luxury. He bowed deeply, promising to work hard and care for the house as if it were his own. That night, he moved in, grateful beyond words. For the first 2 days, life was peaceful. He watered the plants, tidied the grounds, and inspected the gates carefully each evening before locking himself in his room. On the 3rd day, as he worked near the front fence, he met a man who introduced himself as Pravit. This man said he was a caretaker for the house next door and had been in the neighborhood for years. Smiling warmly, Pravit welcomed him and told him to ask for help anytime. The exchange reassured Somchai. Perhaps this place would not feel so lonely after all. But on the 3rd night, everything changed. The air was unnaturally still, so quiet that even the insects seemed to have vanished. Somchai lay awake, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Then came the sound, a harsh scraping, like rope dragging against wood. His pulse spiked. He scanned the room, every muscle tight. At first he saw nothing, then his eyes drifted upward, and his breath caught in his throat. Dangling at eye level in front of him were a pair of bare feet. His gaze rose slowly, unwilling yet unable to stop. Hanging from the ceiling pipe was the swollen face of a man, eyes bulging, tongue protruding. The body swayed gently as though caught in an invisible breeze. Even through the grotesque distortion of death, Somchai recognized him. It was Pravit, the very man who had smiled at him through the fence just 2 days earlier. Frozen in terror, Somchai could not scream, could not move. Then, as if the horror was not enough, the figure's lips parted and a voice hissed into his ear, though the mouth above never moved. "Do you want to try it yourself? You'll enjoy it." A hideous laugh followed, cold and mocking. The world went black. When Somchai woke at dawn, he was lying on the floor, his clothes soaked with sweat and urine. The ceiling above was bare, no sign of the rope, no sign of the man. Shaking, he convinced himself it must have been a nightmare, though deep down he knew it was not. Later that day, as he tended the plants in a daze, he heard someone calling his name. At the gate stood his old friend, the one who had recommended him for the job. Relieved, Somchai rushed over. After a few minutes of small talk, he blurted out, "Does this house have something inside it? Something wrong?" His friend's expression darkened. He hesitated, then sighed. "I didn't want to scare you, but you're not the first caretaker here. That room you're staying in, it belonged to Pravit. Years ago, after his girlfriend left him, he hanged himself in there. Since then, every caretaker who has stayed in that room has seen him. Most don't last a week." Somchai's stomach turned cold. He had not imagined it. He had seen the ghost of a man who had died in despair within those very walls. Unable to abandon the job but unwilling to face the horror again, Somchai begged the owner to let him sleep elsewhere. After a long pause, the owner admitted he knew of the rumors. He had even brought monks to bless the house, but the spirit lingered. At last, he agreed. Somchai could move into the main house at night. For the next 2 years, Somchai remained on the property, watering plants, guarding the gates, and living with the memory of that single night. He never again saw the dangling feet or heard that terrible voice. But every time he passed the caretaker's room, every time he opened the door just to shower or change his clothes, the image came rushing back. The swaying body, the whisper by his ear, the laughter that promised death. It never left him. 2 stories, 2 different countries, yet both tied together by a thread of unbearable loss and the consequences of refusing to let go. In Japan, a mother's grief for her sick child turned her love into a prison. She boarded up the windows, locked her son away from the light, and when death finally claimed him, she could not release him. Her refusal led her to take other children, borrowing them for brief moments of comfort before returning them to their families. To outsiders it was a crime, but to her it was a desperate act of survival, a way to keep pretending her boy was still alive. In the end, her obsession not only trapped her, but bound her son's spirit, leaving him to linger in the shadows of that cellar, still whispering for a friend who never came. In Thailand, despair of a different kind created another restless spirit. A man abandoned by love chose to end his life in the room he had cared for faithfully, leaving his body hanging where the next caretaker would one day sleep. His pain was etched into the walls, his final moments replayed again and again. For Somchai, walking into that room meant walking into another man's last breath. Though monks had tried to bless the house, the spirit remained tethered, bound to the place of his suffering. And while Somchai managed to escape further encounters by moving into the main house, he never escaped the memory of what he saw. The laughter, the voice, the dangling feet, they followed him long after he left the room behind. These stories are not just about haunted houses. They are about what happens when human beings are pushed to their breaking points. A mother who could not face a world without her child. A man who could not endure the loneliness of rejection. Love and despair can twist in ways that blur the line between compassion and cruelty, between longing and madness. And when that line is crossed, the consequences ripple outward, not only for the ones who suffer, but for those who come after them, stepping unknowingly into the shadows left behind. In both tales, there is a warning that extends beyond culture and belief. When grief is clutched too tightly, when obsession hardens into chains, both the living and the dead become trapped. In Japanese tradition, spirits must be allowed to pass on, and clinging to them risks keeping them bound to this world. In Thai belief, sudden and violent deaths often create ghosts that cannot move forward, repeating their final agony. Though the customs differ, the lesson is strikingly similar. Letting go is the only path to peace. Yet letting go is the hardest act of all. It asks us to face emptiness, to accept that what we loved most is gone. Many people might look at the Japanese mother or the Thai caretaker and condemn them for their choices. But others may see something achingly familiar in their stories. The desperate need to hold on to what has slipped away. The refusal to accept a fate that feels unbearable. And so the question lingers. Were they monsters? Or were they simply human beings caught in pain too deep to survive? The tragedy is clear. The mother's devotion turned into abduction, her grief into injustice for other families. The caretaker's despair became a curse for those who followed him. Both crossed boundaries that left behind scars not only in the physical world, but in the spiritual one. Violence and injustice often arise not from hatred, but from wounds left untreated, from love or pride that could not bend. And so, as you listen to these stories, consider what they reveal about our own lives. When we are hurt, when we lose, when we face injustice, do we let go? Or do we allow our pain to become chains that bind us and those around us? Now I want to turn the question to you. What do you think about these two stories? Were they tales of ghosts or of people crushed by suffering? Do you see them as warnings about the dangers of obsession or as reflections of the violence and injustice that life sometimes forces upon us? Share your thoughts in the comments. Speak about what side you would take. Should we condemn these figures for their actions or pity them for their pain? Your perspective matters. By discussing it, by voicing your stance, you help uncover not only the meaning of these stories, but also the meaning of what it is to be human when faced with unbearable loss. In the late 1990s, Japan's countryside was still dotted with wooden homes left behind by families who had moved into the big cities. These houses stood silent, their walls slowly eaten away by damp air and the passage of time. To outsiders, they were only shells of the past, places that looked forgotten. But to those who had lived in them, every floorboard, every locked door, and every window carried memories, some tender, some unbearable. It was one of these houses, sitting on the edge of rice fields in Saitama Prefecture, that became the setting for a story so unsettling that it would stay with everyone who heard it. Takuma was a young architecture student, just starting out his internship at a modest design firm in Tokyo. He had spent most of his first months making coffee, filing papers, and running errands, tasks that left him eager for something real. Something that would make him feel like he was truly on the path to becoming an architect. So when his supervisor dropped a thick folder on his desk one morning, his heart jumped. Inside were blueprints, documents, and an old iron key. The instructions were simple. Travel to Saitama, survey a property left vacant for years, take photos, measure the layout, and return with updated drawings. It would be the first time Takuma had ever been sent out on his own. He could barely contain his excitement as he boarded the train the next morning, his tape measure and flashlight tucked into his bag. The ride stretched long into farmland, where the air smelled of damp soil and the view was broken only by the quiet rise of mountains in the distance. He imagined how he would walk through each room carefully, taking notes like a professional, proving to himself that he was capable of much more than busy work in an office. But as the bus dropped him at the edge of a nearly deserted town, that excitement shifted into unease. The directions led him down a narrow road lined with half-abandoned shops and homes whose gardens had grown wild. When he reached the property, his steps slowed. Before him stood a wooden house with peeling paint, its sliding doors sun-bleached, its roof tiles warped. The silence around it felt heavy, as if the place was holding its breath. Takuma took the key from his pocket and pressed it into the lock. The door groaned open, and a rush of air poured out, thick, stale, and carrying the sharp scent of mildew. Dust swirled in the light, and the wooden floor creaked beneath his shoes. He hesitated on the threshold, suddenly aware of how alone he was. This was no ordinary job site. Something about the air inside felt wrong, as though the house itself had been waiting all these years for someone to walk back in. Still, duty called. He stepped across the threshold, not knowing that what he would uncover inside was not just an abandoned home, but the remnants of a tragedy too heavy for one family to bear. Takuma set his bag near the doorway and clicked on his flashlight, though pale daylight managed to seep through the cracks in the shutters. The beam caught clouds of dust that rose with every step, drifting like tiny ghosts in the stagnant air. The entryway was cluttered with shoes too small to belong to adults, their rubber soles cracked and stiff with age. A wooden coat rack leaned crookedly against the wall. From it hung a child's raincoat, once bright yellow, now faded to the dull color of parchment, its plastic fabric sagging like tired skin. He paused longer than he meant to, staring at it. The coat had clearly not been touched in years, and yet it looked as though someone had just left it behind, after a storm. He shook off the chill crawling up his neck and began his work. He moved carefully from room to room, stretching his tape measure across walls, jotting numbers in his notebook. The kitchen smelled of rust and mold, the sink coated with grime. He turned the faucet out of habit, and nothing came, just a hollow rattle in the pipes. The bathroom was the same, fixtures cracked, tiles discolored. It was clear the utilities had been cut off long ago. In the master bedroom, something unusual broke the silence. As he brushed past an old wardrobe, his shoulder knocked a thick binder from the top shelf. It crashed to the floor, spilling papers that scattered across the dusty tatami mats. Cursing under his breath, he bent down to gather them. That was when he noticed what they were. Medical records. The patient's name read Riku. His eyes traced the diagnosis, a rare congenital condition that caused severe photosensitivity. The description chilled him. Direct exposure to sunlight would trigger blistering, necrosis, and eventually organ failure. Takuma felt his stomach tighten. He replaced the documents quickly, but the words stayed in his head. This was no ordinary illness. Whoever Riku was, he had been condemned to live in darkness. At the end of a dim hallway, one sliding door bore a small sticker with cartoon characters peeling at the edges. Takuma slid it open and stepped inside. The room was different from the rest of the house. Where other spaces were stripped bare, this one still felt lived in. A small bed sat against the wall. A shelf stacked with manga volumes leaned heavily under their own weight, and a dusty CRT television rested beside a game console from decades past. What unnerved him most were the windows. Each one had been boarded shut from the inside. Thick wooden planks nailed tightly across the frames. The nails had rusted to dark red, proof that they had been hammered in long ago and never touched again. On the walls hung drawings made in crayon, sunsets, children playing, stick figures holding hands. One in particular caught his eye. Two boys playing together, with the name Riku scrawled awkwardly at the bottom in a child's hand. On the desk lay a sketchbook. Takuma hesitated, then flipped it open. The first page was almost entirely black, scribbled over with furious strokes. In the corner, shaky letters read, "Today, I can't go outside again. Mom says the sun will hurt me." The second page showed a window covered in boards, with the note, "I want to play outside, but Mom says no." The third was less bleak, a boy smiling next to another child, with the words, "Kaoru plays with me. He's not afraid of the dark." The final page was again swallowed in black, layers of crayon pressed so hard they tore the paper. A sudden sound made his blood run cold. Tap, Tap, tap. He froze, listening. The hallway behind him was silent. He turned back to the room. Again, tap, tap. It was faint but insistent, like knuckles rapping against wood. Heart pounding, he searched under the bed, behind the shelves, inside the closet. Nothing. Then, acting on instinct, he crouched low and tapped the floorboards himself. To his horror, something tapped back. Pulling aside the corner of the rug, Takuma discovered a wooden hatch set flush into the floor. Its edges were worn, as if opened and closed many times, but the handle was slick with dust. He gripped it, pulled hard, and it creaked open to reveal a crude ladder descending into darkness. A breath of damp air rushed out, carrying the smell of stone and something far older, something hidden. Takuma stood at the edge of the hatch, flashlight beam trembling over the rungs of the ladder. Every instinct told him to close it and walk away, to finish his survey and pretend he had seen nothing. But curiosity and a deeper pull, something like dread mixed with duty, pushed him forward. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, placed his foot on the first rung, and began to climb down into the cellar below.